Hello Yu-Gi-Oh players and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! In Business Casual, where we keep the competitive game fun. I'm your host, the RJB0. Today, I'm kicking up my competitive play talk, as in I am going to be doing much more of it more frequently. And today I want to talk about a particular card that I have been looking at that has been kind of disputed in the competitive game as to whether it's useful. I want to talk about... Whoa, my computer just glitched out hard. Anyway, I want to talk about how it can be used competitively and whether or not it's actually worth running in your deck in a competitive setting. And the card I am talking about today is Mirror Force. Mirror Force is one of the most polarizing cards in the game. You either love it or you hate it in a lot of cases. And I'm going to talk today about why people love it and why people hate it. And I'm going to talk about what kinds of decks it is actually useful for, and what the requirements are to use Mirror Force to be at its full potential and actually be a useless card to you I just said useless, a useful card to you when you are at a competitive event. And we are talking big times. We're talking topping regionals. We're talking about going to YCS, to ARGCS, any of those things, times you would want to use Mirror Force. So first off, the criticisms for Mirror Force. A lot of people say two things about Mirror Force. The first is that it's slow, and that's a fair criticism. And the second is that it is not as game-changing as people would like it to be. In a lot of cases, people think that it is, when they play it, they feel like they've wasted a card. It's acted as removal, but it's been too late, or it's too little, or it doesn't negate effects, so it doesn't make as much of a difference in their game, rather than if they had run something like Fiendish Chain, or this card, Dimensional Prison, which I'm going to get back to right now. In my opinion, a lot of the people who say that Mirror Force doesn't make a huge difference in their game, and that it takes up room that could be used for better cards, they have a point for the most part, but a lot of the time when a person says that, they haven't been thinking through actually whether Mirror Force makes a big impact on their game. The reason why they say what they say is because it tends to be that people who talk like that fire off Mirror Force at the first chance they get, the first time that they can plus, or when they would take a little bit of damage that they don't want to take, or they want to save a monster that they kind of like. So a lot of people actually waste their Mirror Force rather than use it in its most optimal setting. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people consider it to not be as effective a card as they would like to, versus something like D-Prison, where if they take it as a 1-for-1, it actually makes a large difference in the game, because say you're playing against +1 Fire Fist, which is the most popular deck out there right now. If you hit a bear with this card, it's much more useful than if you hit the 1-for-1 bear with a Mirror Force, because now that bear is in the graveyard and it's live. It's live for, for Wolf Bark, as opposed to if you had deprisoned it, it would be out of the way. They couldn't bring it back with Call of the Haunted, which a couple of people were running this weekend, and might be a more common thing in the future. And, of course, they do not have the target for Wolf Bark anymore. So a lot of people are saying that Deprison is a more optimal card to run than Mirror Force, and if you're going to run more removal, you're going to want to either go 2-1 with the Deprison to Mirror Force, or just not run the Mirror Force altogether. And that's a valid point for a lot of the time. However, there are decks that can make good use of Mirror Force, and there are times at which Mirror Force is an extremely optimal card, and I'm going to talk to you about the two factors that make playing Mirror Force competitive. And those two factors I'm going to talk about are first, timing, and second, pressure. So let's talk about timing first. A lot of the reason why people end up running Mirror Force incorrectly, in my opinion, misplaying with Mirror Force, is because they fire it off at the first opportunity that looks pretty good. You'll see people, if your opponent puts a plus on the board, if they have multiple monsters, they're like, oh, I can capitalize off of having Mirror Force, so I can wipe those monsters off the board and get a plus. Which, yes, it's a plus, but pluses don't mean a whole lot in the long run if it means that you've used up a play like a Mirror Force, or if you have used up resources that could have been used to stop a play later game. Pluses, when it comes to Mirror Force, aren't actually that big of a difference. And I'll get to that in a second, but the problem with a lot of people with Mirror Force is they aren't willing to wait to use it. And a lot of the decks that can run Mirror Force are these control type decks that can back up their plays. If they don't hit the Mirror Force, if they allow their monster to get run over, they can come back from that. They can put a bear on the board and pop the opponent's bear. They can, in the case of my Thunder family deck, which is the way that I make the most optimal use of my Mirror Forces, I can allow my Sis Hunter to get run over, and then in my next turn I can put a Constellar Omega on the board and run over the monster that killed my Sis Hunter, and I didn't need that Mirror Force at the time in order to clear my opponent's board. The same goes for when I use Paladynamo. If my opponent has multiple monsters on the board, I can Paladynamo one of them, run over the other one, and then they've just got a useless monster sitting on the board. So in those cases, I don't have to use the Mirror Force at the first opportunity I get to get a plus. If I do that, I have still gone at plus because I've hit the Paladynamo or the Arknight or something, and I've still been able to run over those monsters, but I didn't use up the backup that happens in the form of Mirror Force. However, later in the game, this actually happened to me a lot, which is later in the game, after I had waited on my Mirror Force for a long time, my opponent would feel lulled into a sense of security, because I've had this card sitting on the board that if it was a Mirror Force, I would have had multiple opportunities to plus off of it in the past. They get a little more bold about making their moves, and they overextend themselves a little bit more, and at that point, when you've got the chance to turn the game around, when you have the opportunity to close down the game, they're making their final last-ditch effort, that's when you hit your Mirror Force. That's when you clear their board. And then, either if you were losing, and this was the case a lot for me with Thunder Family in the last tournament that I was at, when I was playing against a lot of good competitive players, especially Constellar players and Harpy players, then if you hit it at that point in the game, I was massively behind in some cases, and I hit the Mirror Force, and the game totally turned around in my favor at that point. The second, and possibly even more important factor of being able to use Mirror Force competitively is pressure. And the reason why I say that is because if your opponent puts a monster on the board, and they attack, and you don't do anything, and you don't give them any reason to put any more monsters on the board, they're just going to sit on that monster and keep poking you with it. If it's a bear, you're in trouble. In that case, you would definitely want to use the D-Prison. But if your deck can put pressure on your opponent, absolutely do that if you have the Mirror Force down. Because if you put pressure on your opponent, then they're going to feel more obligated to make bad moves or to make riskier moves in order to get around your plays. And risky moves are the best case scenario. If your opponent is making risky moves, that's the best thing you could possibly hope for if you've got a Mirror Force down on the board. So if you can put pressure on your opponent, they're more likely to make risky moves. They're going to put more monsters on the board trying to get rid of your field. If you can keep putting down outs, then they are more likely to try and spam for field presence. They're trying to increase their position on the board, and once they do that, they are walking right into your Mirror Force. So if your deck can produce both of those factors, they can defend themselves to the point that they can, or they can fend for themselves, not necessarily defend themselves, but they can operate to the point where they don't necessarily need to hit the Mirror Force the second they get the option to plus. They can create pluses on their own, like in +1 Fire Fist and Thunder Family. These are just two of the examples that I can use right now because they're the ones on the top of my head. If you can keep that pressure going and you can make sure that you can time that Mirror Force at the time when it would be absolutely game-changing or it would mean the end of the game, then you can use Mirror Force effectively. Otherwise, you might want to go with the D-Prison or Fiendish Chain or Effect Veiler or something else that can do more stopping of plays rather than responding to them. So I hope you guys liked this video. I totally messed up that outro. Anyway, I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why in the comments section below. And then, of course, subscribe for more decks discussion and analysis and general Yu-Gi-Oh! Shenanigans. Meanwhile, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I got a jet. See you guys.